Welcome to the Stewardship Leader Podcast, brought to you by the Christian Stewardship Network. CSN exists to teach and equip church leaders the biblical perspective on finances so they can speak with authority, confidence, and integrity. To learn more, visit us at christianstewardshipnetwork.com. Well, hey everyone, welcome to Stewardship Leader. I'm your host, Leo Sabo, and today I have Dr. Shane Ennett with us. He is the Assistant Professor of Finance at Biola University. He's also a friend of ministry. I've met him just a little while back, a few months ago, but so far, everything that he has done, he's helped us with our ministry, done some great work, and I'm just so excited about having him on and talk about investing, the history of investing. We're actually going to do a series here of 4 episodes. And we're going to learn a lot. I know I'm going to learn a lot. I've already looked at his notes, and there's things in here that I'm excited to hear, and I think you will as well. Shane, why don't you say hello to everyone? And then if you would, just introduce yourself, however you'd like. What would you like our audience to know about you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Leo. So I'm working at Biola University as an assistant professor of finance, and I've been there about 10 years now. But before Biola, I was in the investments buy side, doing institutional investing. So I managed money in terms of using a Graham and Dodd value philosophy. I looked at primarily insurance stocks. And then I also, after that, went on to do investment consulting for large investment pensions and endowments. But yeah, so now I'm at Biola. I kind of always wanted to go into investing, into teaching investing. That was kind of always the plan to work 10 years in the industry and then parlay that into academia. I actually had that plan in high school. So it's been real neat to see the Lord kind of affirm that plan and guide me along it. But now I'm teaching classes related to investing and to financial planning and institutional finance as well.
Wonderful. Well, as I said at the beginning, very excited for you to share in this area. This is an area that unfortunately the church just doesn't lean into. One of our ministries that have been a partner for many years is Sound Mind Investing, and they've come to some of our forums. And Matt Bell is a friend. I've known him for many, many years. And this is an area that there's just not a lot of voices talking about what does investing look like? What's really the Christian perspective on investing? How do we as Christians invest, something we should be doing, and how do we do it in a way that isn't wrapped up in the more is better lifestyle creep, all of those things that happen, and yet still know that God has given us this principle of multiplication. We're supposed to be faithful to that, both in a natural sense, also in a spiritual sense. So I'm excited about getting into it. Why don't we do just that? Just go ahead and start wherever you like as far as the history of investing.
Yeah. So just to give you a little bit of an outline, I wanted to talk about the history of investing. And then in the next podcast, I want to talk about the philosophies that have kind of emerged through this history and how people actually strategize and create strategies around how they believe, what they believe with investing. And then I want to go on to talking about how the Christian marketplace in investing has emerged from those philosophies and from the history. And then finally, in our last episode, wanted to talk about the future and what we should expect, particularly with AI and with robo-advising and all that. But I thought we could lay the groundwork and foundation by talking about just kind of go way back with investing, go to kind of the beginning of investing and follow things along in a sequence. How do we get to today? How do we get to this moment where you're in college or you're in your education, you get your job, and then they push you into, this complex target date fund with hundreds of thousands of companies. And, if you were to try and explain that to someone 200 years ago or thousands of years ago, it would be an incredibly, they would just, I think, not really understand what's going on. And in many ways, I think we shouldn't understand what's going on. It's a really confusing time in terms of investing, but how do we get to this place? So I wanted to kind of follow through a few key moments in history.
Great.
Let's kind of begin things around ancient Greece. And back during this time and, all of the previous generations prior to the Greeks, there was no investing. So investing didn't exist. Really, all that was true was you either own land or you didn't own land. If you owned land, then you were considered the wealthy. You were the haves. And then if you didn't own lands, you were the have nots. And so there were just people who had wealth that were born into it, and then they had a surplus, and people who didn't. The big question that a lot of the Greek philosophers asked with money wasn't how do you invest money, how do you build wealth? It was really what do you do with the surplus? So if you're in this category of people and you have a surplus, what do you do with it? So we have some nice documentation and arguments from both Aristotle and Xenophon, kind of around 400 BC. And they provided this term called oikonomia. And really, when I first read this term, I got so excited because what that word is, it means, law of the household. And that's essentially another word for financial planning. So personal financial planning. And they weren't thinking about how can we build wealth for a household. They were thinking about if you have the wealth, how do you spend it? Oikos, meaning home, and nomia, law. So what's the law of the household? How should you invest surplus? Back then, kind of the three uses of surplus they could imagine were political, philosophical, and then luxurious. And so right now, I think most people only conceive of the third, that if you have surplus, then, you spend it in some way for comfort. But back then, they didn't have educational systems. They didn't have a political system. So the people with the surplus were the ones that helped create kind of the ability to further education, the ability to further politics. And Aristotle said that if you focused on the luxurious as a way to spend your surplus, that was a perversion of the good life, a disordering, if you will, as St. Augustine would say. But really, the Greeks, just kind of had an argument. How should you spend surplus? It should be towards virtue. It should be towards furthering a society, a common good, if you will. But modern investing really started with Rome. So Rome was one of the first times in history where you had an incredible consolidation of power to such an extent where they could create money. And so the moment you were able to kind of move beyond a bartering kind of culture and start to actually coin and have a press where you're printing coins that had the image of, Caesar, and then you have, the ability to tax, you have the ability to kind of create this whole economic system. That's where the marketplace could emerge, and that's where modern banking could emerge. And that really is the beginning of investing. But if we're thinking about kind of the beginning of investing, it wasn't what it looks like now. It wasn't that, oh, I have some money, I'm going to invest it. It was the landowners had the money, and before they just had the land, but now they actually have these coins. They have this this idea of a fiat kind of currency. And so then they started to develop, a centralized place to put it, which was the bank. So they own the banks, they own the lands. They're starting to funnel a banking system that's the beginning of the emergence of a marketplace where people, instead of just kind of serving the landowners kind of in a servitude way, they actually started to become more like an employee. Not quite, but more like it, to where they were getting wages instead of just, being allowed to not die on the land. What's interesting is the banking was kind of the beginning of investing. And so these landowners are actually earning a rate of return. There's some sort of employment around making investments. And temples were actually the earliest location of banks, which I think is kind of like one of the yeah, one of the earliest kind of integrations of religion and finance is that the temples were the most secure place to put money, and then people also equated the need of, it just cost a lot of money to do sacrifices. It costs a lot of money to kind of run a religion, and so the banks being in the temples made sense. And yeah.
Well, we know Jesus said something about that and had some nasty words to the people that were actually doing that commerce right in the temple court.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, yeah.
So it's kind of like maybe a bad omen for the beginning of investing, to have it be located in some temples. And we have kind of an evolution then. So really, it was still just kind of the landowner, rich folks just kind of making themselves richer, just doing a little more formalized within a banking, lending capacity. The medieval period saw the rise of a more formal marketplace, saw the use of cash to do bartering. And Thomas Aquinas, he was really a big voice during this time. And there was all this great suspicion around money, because money was something that was considered potentially immoral because it allowed for a greater accumulation. It allowed you to accumulate beyond your needs. And that was kind of a big deal. Before, you would just kind of accumulate stuff and then it was clear whether you needed it or not. But here, you can just kind of like, it could kind of feed a certain type of greed that maybe wasn't available before. One quote I have here from Thomas Aquinas is, he says, of all the ways to get wealth, money breeding money is the most unnatural.
Mm.
And so during the emergence of this idea of compounding interest, time value of money, this was the beginning of finance, of opportunity costs. It was a strange idea, and we can make arguments about how money, if you lend it or if you invest it, it should earn a rate of return. Otherwise, there's loss. And so it's not that money is, unnaturally earning money. It's just being compensated for risk, which creates good commerce and industry. But I still think they have a good point. I think there's danger, in this type of enterprise. So when you're during this kind of medieval periods, the banking got more and more mature. And what you'll see is the bankers were more powerful often than the royalties and the people in power. And I have a few examples of how kingdoms, when they wanted to finance their wars and expand, they would use the landowners. They would use the families that had the wealth, and they'd get into trouble with these landowners and wealthy people. And so like Charles V of Spain, he relied on the Fugger banking family of Germany, and he would get loans from them. King John of England largely relied on Jewish moneylenders, and that's where Shakespeare's play Merchant of Venice kind of really was born out of. So much of that relationship between the King of England and this really well established money lending banking enterprise amongst the Jewish people of that time. And Philip the Fourth of France, he relied on the Knights Templar, and our family just watched the Nicolas Cage movie, where it's about the stealing of the Constitution. Do you remember what that was called?
National Treasure, I think.
Yeah, National Treasure, where they talk about the Knights Templar, but apparently they were big bankers, and they were actually lenders to Philip the Fourth of France, and then King John was with the Jewish lenders, so the banking really didn't have any big innovation. It was still just kind of landowners, rich people, and so it wasn't modern day investing. I'd mark the beginning of modern day investing to the invention of, you ready for this? The double entry journal accounting.
Interesting.
So this is the glory of accounting here is that I think that they were the catalyst for creating modern day investing. So most people will kind of mark the date of modern day investing to the creation of the Limited Liability Corporation, the LLC.
Mm.
But I want to back up just a little bit and say it was actually the creation of double entry journal accounting, because before double entry journal accounting, and this was kind of created around the 13th century, and there's a lot of debate whether it was in Croatia or whether it was in Italy. I'm going to say it was Italy, particularly in Venice, and so these Venice or Florence tradesmen started creating a system of tracking their entries, and the financial transactions were becoming more and more complex. And so they decided to use these T accounts where you had debits and credits, and you had the famous finance equation: assets equals liabilities plus equity, which forms a T if you have assets on the left. And then, so it's the use of money on the left, and on the right is the source of money. So every transaction has two sides to it. And really, it was an incredible way to organize financial transactions, and it allowed for the conception of equity. So prior to this, you couldn't, it was very difficult to conceive of equity. It just made sense. Lending made sense, like, oh, I'm borrowing, so I'm getting money and then I'm paying it back. But equity is a little bit different. When you have this idea of intangible assets and depreciation and accruals, all of that really was birthed out of the T account. And so I think that snowballed into the creation of the LLC, which is really the greatest foundational kind of moment for modern day investing. And do you know the first LLC,
Do I know when it started? No.
or what company it was?
No.
It was the Dutch East India Company.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
So that
Sure.
was in 1600. Traveling around the globe, really the innovation of shipbuilding,
Yep.
the stability enough of these empires to build ships and to trade. All of it was kind of a buzz and going really well. And so you had businesses and you had the marketplace well established. You had the banks, and so you had all the rich people kind of involved in getting trade going. And so we were in a moment in the 1600s with double entry journal accounting, to say, hey, we should do something different, because right now the only way to get money is you have to convince a very few amount of people to give us money. And those very few people are hard to convince because they bear full liability. So, if the ship goes down, or if there's a mutiny, or if there's something, like, they have full risk. And what if there was a way to get more people involved in the financing of these ventures? So they created this idea of separating the business and making it a separate legal entity that had its own tax ID, and then the investors would buy shares. They would have they break up the equity into shares, issue those shares to the public, and then the public could buy, and then they're not locked in because they have a share that's now tradable, and so they can sell it in a marketplace. And it was an incredible moment to realize that now a company is kind of its own entity, and if you invest in it, you can both do a small amount, and you're only liable to the amount you give. You're not necessarily legally liable. They can't take your home if you buy a share in the Dutch East Indies Company. And this was the moment that a lot of money was made during this time. So people made so much money, and it went beyond the traditional bankers. It went to the merchants, it went to the tradesmen, it went to, I don't know how far down the line of the social ladder it went, but it went far, and it became a cultural phenomenon. And so then that really led towards, the stock market, the creation of the stock market, because more companies are like, we want to do this. And in the end, this cascaded towards this idea of, before someone had a good idea, they had to know people, and it took forever to kind of get off the ground. And it usually didn't, especially if it was a risky idea. But now all you have to do is have a great idea, and you still have to know people, but it's not quite the same. The good idea, if you get the right VC, if you get the right angel investor, you can get the product going, you can get it out there, you can crowdfund. But good ideas get financed. And the beginning of that was kind of this creation of the LLC, which, and I'm arguing, is go back a little bit further to these Florence, Venice tradesmen creating these T accounts. And once you separated a company, and now you can buy things and not be a part of the operation of it, you don't really know what's going on with it. People own hundreds of companies. They're not tracking what the managers are doing. They're essentially have hired agents to manage their businesses, and they that introduce this idea of agency cost, and also moral hazard, where you're now relying on people who may have different agenda. And I read once, they call this the loss of innocence, where you now are pushing money towards businesses and having other people do it for you. And so there's a cost, and we'll get into this cost a little bit more when we talk about the modern Christian day investing. But this is a moment of greatness and a moment of sadness, I think, in history.
This episode of the Stewardship Leader podcast is sponsored by Financial Planning Ministry. FPM exists to fund ministry by educating families and facilitating generosity in planned giving. We serve over 150 ministry partners and over 50,000 families. Through the promotion of Christ-centered stewardship and responsible estate planning, millions of dollars have been saved from probate and over $2.7 billion have been directed to Christian churches and charities through planned giving. To learn more about us, check us out online at fpm.org.
Well, one thing that's kind of been running in the back of my mind as you were introducing these different time periods is because at the beginning you said that, who was it? Aristotle said, luxurious is a perversion of good life. So there seems to be, especially early on, and then of course throughout, and we know this even today, that money, we know the scripture, right? That the love of money creates all kinds of evil. So is there more evidence, or do you have you seen through your study that this idea of morality and how you use money, especially as it came to investing and growing wealth, the haves and have-nots, when everybody was kind of equal, you either had land or didn't have land, there was a little bit more. It wasn't such a disparity between one group and the other, right? The king was the only one that had more than everybody else. Pretty much everybody else was kind of in two groups, but still today, especially as I look at our modern world, you see so much disparity. There's people that are literally hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth, and then there's a group that think these people are evil. They may not be, and they may have great companies and employ a lot of people, but again, there's this uh, morality that comes along with money and how we view money, and investing can pervert that. So talk about that a little bit more, because I think this is what you're kind of getting at, that it was kind of a loss of innocence, so to speak,
Yeah.
if there was innocence at this point, because now that gap can so much widen, and literally companies can abuse people by making profits the number one reason they do what they do. Can you talk about that a little bit? Is there evidence in that this was kind of where it began to kind of go rogue?
No, yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I was just reading a book on the early church, and they tried to categorize all the social classes during the early church. And what they said, and there was a really interesting argument to be made. They said that everyone was basically either right below subsistence, where they're not quite getting by, or they're just getting by. But there's no middle class, and then there's a very small percentage who have this great surplus. And so to your point, it's like everyone was miserable, whereas now we have well, there still is kind of pretty bad poverty, pretty extreme poverty, but there's a lot more variety of experiences. We have a middle class, we have the suburbs, we have the rich, and so the polarization between the groups, I'd say I'd probably make the argument there was less polarization because everyone was kind of at subsistence. But I don't know if that's where you want to go back to. It's nice when where we're at, even though
I
there's
won't
a
trade it.
bigger gap
I
between.
won't trade
Yeah,
it.
yeah, the 1% and the 99. But I, but the virtue of back then was everyone was kind of in it together a little bit more. Because even the tradesmen, the merchants, they didn't rise. There was no social class mobility, and so there's a little bit more sense of maybe being together. Whereas here, it's kind of like my favorite analogy on this is poker. I love watching it. I love, like, one of my favorite things is Texas Hold'em on ESPN, where you see the probabilities and you get to see people making decisions. But as people get more and more chips, they're usually the ones that are the most skilled. They get to do the strategy where they'll just kind of use their chips to push everyone else out. And it's really a great strategy. It's just the perks of having all the chips and the skill. And I think that if you don't have any redistribution of wealth, what just naturally happens is, by skill and by a few other kind of systemic kind of things, their chip count grows, and then they can use their big chip count to kind of push everyone else out. And I think that this is like been around from the history of the world. And I think God, when he created kind of people and community, saw that this is just naturally going to happen, because it's just what naturally happens with people who have skill to make money and others who, for a variety of reasons, don't. And so I think God's economic idea was brilliant. I think it's the most brilliant idea ever, and I love it. And it never happened, which was the 50-year Jubilee, was this idea of let's have land not be something you necessarily own. Let's have it be given, by tribe. And then let's have everything reset every 50 years. And I don't know, the more I ponder the Jubilee, the more I'm just like, that was incredibly brilliant. And that would just solve so many social problems, even though it's hard to conceive it. I understand that I may be making some people mad, but I loved it. And I don't know of any other way of solving this problem that you're seeing with kind of the wealthier getting wealthier and the greed that kind of infects the system.
Yeah, and unfortunately, because again, the love of money and the root of so many things that we see in the world that we don't want to see, is because at the core, mankind is still corrupt and greed just grows. And then, of course, like you said, if a few have tremendous wealth, we see that even in our political climates across the world now, how supposedly the oligarchs are kind of running things, right? So again, we're not going to get into that. That's not really the point of this. But to realize that there was, like you, I believe that the year of Jubilee kind of reset it in the right way. It didn't allow anybody to become an oppressor or, yeah. So unfortunately, we are where we are. But I think the reason I wanted to do these episodes, the series of episodes with you, is because so many Christians, I believe, are looking at investing, and I think there's two main camps in my small estimation. Is one is investing is for the people who are rich, people who have it. I might be able to save a little bit in my 401k, and maybe I won't have to work until I'm 90. Maybe that's a win for some. And then for others, of course, especially in Christianity, is can I invest? Where do I invest? Am I part of some kind of moral hazard I'm not even aware of? Right. That's where the responsible investing, right, biblically responsible investing came in, and all of that. So I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on where does the moral fiber of this thing and where does it splint off?
Yeah, and really, the success of the limited liability corporation, the ability, this really was the engine for social mobility, because people could successfully have an idea that then made them rich, or they could successfully finance the idea that made them rich. And so this was the first time people were like, oh, I could create wealth and not be and go from kind of rags to riches. And the hope of this was during the Enlightenment time, was this is science, and science will fix all of our problems. We could actually, right now, our big problem is people need food and people need health. We could actually use finance to solve all cultural problems. We will enter into a utopia, and as long as everyone's wealthy and we create the right, because Adam Smith during this time just thought, under what they call consumer sovereignty theory, he said, if we just let the markets work with the invisible hand, and we kind of protect property rights and let the marketplace work, the LLCs, the financing of ideas, then you'll have, what he says is, it'll create a uniform, constant, and uninterrupted effort of every man to better his condition. And it will create a type of progress where we will have kind of, the end of our needs, essentially. Like everything basically will be nirvana. And so that's kind of the hope and promise of investing during the beginning of it, because it was incredible, because it was new, and people saw that they could rise and create wealth. And you move on towards fractional reserve banking, also was a big innovation, and that led to the mortgage and home ownership, and then finally modern portfolio theory, which said, before, people were like, well, I should really only own one thing that I really understand. And then, Markowitz in the 50s was like, well, if you actually design a portfolio, then you can create a risk efficiency, and you don't necessarily have to know everything about everything, because the risk will kind of, there's a diversification benefit. And that led to the creation of mutual funds, which then led to the ETF, and to where we are today in our kind of a crazy world, where I tell my college students, you're 22 years old, you get your first job, and now they're asking you, how do you want to invest? And they have zero idea unless, they've taken my classes, and they're being forced to kind of become an investor of hundreds, if not thousands of companies. And they have no idea what these companies do, who these companies are. And there's a complete disconnect between the investor and the manager and the corporation and the capital. And I kind of bring it all back to Genesis 2, where God creates, he gives Adam and Eve a job. He says, all right, I want you to work the land, but he doesn't stop there. He says, I want you to work it and watch it. And so I think with investing, all of the inventions that have come out of it, which I love, I love investing. I love how good ideas get financed. I think that's a beautiful thing, so we work it really well. The output has been just kind of nonstop and accelerating. But we don't watch it. We've forsaken our watching. We just let the land and we exploit it, and we're not seeing that it's being overused and it's causing harm. Exploit it. That's essentially what happens when you don't watch over it. Is you abuse it, and all of the land, which is the community and the environments and the employee, and so that to me is the rise of the Christian marketplace, the Christian conscience, to look at what's going on and say, we also have this prerogative. We should be watching what's going on, and maybe not being quite as productive because we're going beyond the limits of kind of the purview of the land that God gave us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like taking it to an extreme of, again, being driven by greed. More is better. And that lends to this idea, like, if you could, why wouldn't you? Well, again, going back to the whole principle of the Jubilee was not just so that people would get the rest, but that the land would get the rest,
Yeah.
that it would have that opportunity to kind of get healthy again so that they can start the next cycle. And I see that in the way the market works. It used to be you can only invest, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Now there are, if you get on Robinhood or other apps, there are investments that are pretty much 24/7. And of course, you've got different markets opening at different times. So it does create this unhealthy pace to just acquire and grow. There are great opportunities. I love capitalism. I love the way it works. But I do think that from a moral Christian perspective, we have to go back to, was this God's intent, and where do we veer off as we think about investing in growth? Not answering the question, how much is enough? What is God actually leading me to do? Not what do I want to do, or what is the culture or the pressures that I'm under or whatever to keep up with the Joneses. What does that do? And I think this is why this topic is so important. And I also believed, Shane, is that the reason why the church seems to not address it is because it is a topic they either don't understand or they think it's somewhat immoral. And I think that's like forsaking, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's like, no, this is something we should be doing. We should be part of everything that's in the culture, influence that. And this is one of those areas that has the potential to either lift and take people out of poverty, or it can literally bring them into poverty because of abuses that we kind of shrug off and say, "Well, we're not going to address that. That's not a moral issue." Well, money is very moral. Jesus talked about it quite a bit because it has to do with the heart. Anything else you want to talk about in this episode before we end? Just a few more minutes.
I think the hope of investing, I think people who aren't seeing God as their hope will put too much hope in, because compounding interest, Albert Einstein called it the eighth wonder of the world. And it really is a wonder. It's a power to see things grow exponentially. Anything in nature that grows exponentially is a power to reckon with. And so I think you should always reckon with that power and maybe use it as a tool, but you should never hope in it. And you should always realize the limitations of it. I always compare compounding interest to the compounding growth of God's kingdom. And Daniel, to me, has the best verse of this, where he talks about the kingdom of God is a rock that strikes the kingdoms of man, and it starts as this like small stone, and then it becomes a mountain, and then it overtakes the whole world. And so if you just imagine the exponential growth of something that starts as a rock and overtakes the world, that's God's kingdom. And we can align and hope in that growth. Whereas that kind of puts into perspective the growth of investing, the hope of investing is kind of small. To me, it's like a flickering candle versus the sun. It's still a light. It's still something that helps, but it is something that's limited in its actual ability to cause both change and good.
Agreed. Well, one more thing I wanted to mention before we end today is, again, we're going to do this as a 4-part series, so please join us for the next one. But I wanted to mention your book, Whole Heart Finances. This is a book that you've written, and you also have a website. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book before we end? And also, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, learn more about what you're doing, share that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So my book was kind of born out of this desire to help people draw near to Jesus as they learn about money. And it's a basic exploration of all the main topics of personal finance, but how do you learn about saving and credit and budgeting in a way that actually draws you near to the heart of Jesus? So you need your whole heart when you're learning about money. So it's both practical and it's theological. It gets at the heart because money, is, as you've mentioned, is something, a matter of the heart. And so the website is wholeheartfinances.com. So it has that plural S at the end. I have a 4 part kind of experience lesson plan that you can go through on your phone. It was kind of designed for the phone. And then the book itself you can buy on Amazon. There's links on the website to getting it. But yeah, it's just been such a privilege and fun to kind of share kind of how I teach my students and also how I go into churches and help them. So this book is, after 10 years of doing this, kind of a best practice of what I do.
Well, thank you, Shane, again for being here. I look forward to the next episodes. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for listening. We are so thankful that you are consistently listening to Stewardship Leader. My hope is that this episode and this series really blesses you. If you find it helpful, please share it with at least one other church or stewardship leader. We'd love for them to know that we exist, that we have content like this, and hope it'll benefit them as well. If you want to know more about CSN, you can find us at christianstewardshipnetwork.com. We have an event coming up soon, the Christian Stewardship Network Forum. This is our annual forum that happens around March every year. This one will be March 3rd through the 5th, and it's in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So if you're somewhere up north, this is a perfect time to get warmed up. Come down to Fort Lauderdale. This is a 3-day event. We also start with a Stewardship Impact Workshop. This is a fantastic workshop that will lay a biblical foundation of stewardship and generosity so that you have a good understanding of what does Scripture say, but also what does it look like inside the church. So we'd love for you to join us for that. You can find out more on our website. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time on Stewardship Leader.